Lori and Larry got to know each other after they both had a few failed marriages and several children behind them. However, over the years, they managed to bring along a wonderful sense of love, and on the morning of February 13th, right before Valentine's Day, they had a romantic date, which cost one of them their life. Larry and Lori Eisenberg had just returned from Idaho, where the man had ticked a few items off his bucket list. He wanted to watch the shuttle launch, ride a fan boat, and learn sailing. On the cold morning of February 13, 2018, Larry, aged 68, and his wife Lori, aged 64, woke up early to watch the sunrise. They took their motorboat out into the calm waters of Lake Coeur d'Alene in Idaho to enjoy the first rays of sun at a picturesque spot called Sam Bay before driving to breakfast at an exclusive resort. Unfortunately, these wishes were not fulfilled. Just a few hours later, at 10:25 a.m., the sheriff's office of Kootenai County received a distress call. The woman's voice broke into a scream. She was choking on sobs, but as she calmed down a bit, she was able to explain to the emergency operator what had happened. Larry and Lori Eisenberg had been together for 17 years. Each of them had several children from previous relationships, but still, they never argued and always looked for reasons to praise each other. Relatives and friends spoke of them as a wonderful couple that could carry its love over the years. On the eve of Valentine's Day, the man was in a romantic mood, considering every day as the most beautiful of his life, always appearing everywhere with a smile on his face. That morning, Larry sent his daughter a photo of the sunrise before his departure and wrote to a friend that the fishing trip was canceled because he felt a bit unwell. The Eisenbergs boarded the boat. Larry started the engine, and the boat gently rocked them towards the sun on the water. They were quite far from the shore when the engine suddenly went out. The man went to the bow of the ship to see what had happened with the engine when suddenly Larry felt dizzy and fell overboard into the icy water. Lori, who had not expected such an event, panicked and rushed to help him, but she tripped, fell, and hit her head on something, causing her nose to bleed. When she stood up, her husband was nowhere to be found. He had apparently disappeared into the dark water. Attempts to find the mobile phone were unsuccessful. Then Lori tried to start the engine, but as Larry fell, he apparently broke the ignition switch, and she had to start the engine manually. The desperate woman circled the spot where her husband had fallen into the water. As she looked into the lake's mirror surface, desperately trying to find him, she was afraid to continue swimming or to return to shore for fear of losing orientation. She even honked the boat's horn several times to attract someone's attention. When Lori realized it was all in vain, she first felt cold all over her body. She took out the blanket and saw her husband's mobile phone as she called the rescue service. About 2 hours had passed since Larry disappeared into the icy water. After the call, Lori hopelessly let her hand sink, and the phone slipped overboard. Shortly after 11 a.m., officers at the nearby coast dispatched a rescue boat to bring the distressed woman to land for medical treatment, while the Eisenbergs' boat was towed for further investigation. Although at first glance everything seemed like a tragic accident, the police had to ensure there were no indications of a crime. Larry was likely already dead after more than 2 hours in the water. Survival under such harsh conditions is nearly impossible. Now it was necessary to reproduce a detailed picture of the incident and verify the truthfulness of the woman's words. Upon boarding the ship, investigators immediately noticed blood splatters in several places, likely due to the woman's nosebleed. Although Lori's statement that the ignition switch was defective just before Larry went underwater, the police found a switch, and the rope on the floor seemed odd to the investigators because, for the engine to start, the switch and belt must be attached to the ignition lock. Moreover, the ignition key was significantly bent, indicating a possible struggle. They also searched Lori's pockets. In her handbags, there were several keys and an empty juice bottle. All items were seized as evidence, and the boat was taken to a nearby parking lot for storage. The truck that towed the Eisenbergs' boat was also inspected, but nothing special was found. One of the officers noticed Lori's lost mobile phone and a bottle of allergy medication on the center console. It was an over-the-counter drug. The search for Larry Eisenberg in the water was complicated by the fact that he wore dark clothing, and Lori did not know exactly where the boat was when the man went overboard. Therefore, the search area was significantly expanded. Instead of a rescue diver, a decision was made to use an acoustic group. Search and rescue helicopters also flew over the lake, hoping to find the body of the drowned man, but to no avail. On the first day, the sonar rescue team spent 3.5 hours searching for Larry in the cold water of the lake. Experts searched for the body until it became too dark to see anything. Meanwhile, one of the officers met with Lori Eisenberg at the hospital where the woman had been taken after the incident. He wanted to determine a more precise search area, so he showed her a map of the lake and asked her to tell him again how Larry fell into the water and what exactly happened with the boat's engine. Lori said that after a walk by the lake, she started saying something about the resort they wanted to go to. Initially, he had planned to go fishing in the morning, but his health deteriorated in the morning, so they simply decided to enjoy the morning and have breakfast at the resort. At that moment, the engine went out, and Larry went to see what the problem was. Lori herself stayed inside and watched through the glass what her husband was doing. Suddenly, he turned around, became pale, and began to fall to the side. Apparently, he supported himself on the key at the moment of the fall, and it bent in the ignition lock. The woman thought something was wrong with his heart and rushed to help him. If she had not tripped at the most inopportune moment, Larry might still have been alive. Lori covered her face with her hands and was silent for a while, only her shoulders trembling with silent sobs. A few minutes later, she ran her finger over the map, but could not determine the exact location of the tragedy. Her thoughts were confused, and she could not remember whether there were trees or houses nearby, from which side the sun was shining. She even lost her sense of time as she searched for her husband in the water. In such situations, a minute can seem like an eternity. Due to the great depth of the lake and the low water temperature, the search for the body was very difficult. First, the sonar team had to find the drowned person, and then with the help of rescue divers, lift the body to the surface. Since efforts to find Larry were still unsuccessful, investigators called Lori on February 18th, 5 days after the tragedy, and asked her to accompany the sonar group to the lake. However, the presence of the woman was only a nuisance. She still could not remember any concrete landmarks. The lack of any information about the location seemed strange to the investigators, but Eisenberg's behavior surprised them even more. During the search work, Lori joked, laughed irrelevantly, and then suddenly began to sob as if she remembered why she was invited to the lake. Not enough time had passed since the death of a loved one, and Lori apparently could not come to terms with the thought that her husband was no longer alive and now felt guilty because she had shown positive feelings. Our paradise, that's what the Eisenbergs called their home. After her husband's death, Lori could no longer stay in the house where they had lived happily for 17 years. When the woman returned from the lake that day, she began to actively prepare the residence of Larry and Lori, located 20 minutes southwest of the city. The woman invited her relatives to help move all the things and furniture out of the house because she wanted to sell it as quickly as possible. Vigilant neighbors reported this to the police. It seemed to them that the woman was behaving somehow strangely and suspiciously. Lori Eisenberg was proud to have worked for the North Idaho Housing Coalition for many years, and recently the chief accountant of this institution ordered an internal audit because he noticed some violations. Many employees suspected that something illegal was going on in the coalition, but when the truth came to light, all employees were literally stunned. This shocking revelation aroused the interest of investigators and gave the investigations a completely new direction. Lori Eisenberg was suspected of possible fraudulent activity related to the theft of coalition funds, amounting to $500,000. The woman was suspended and threatened with dismissal. Everyone who knew her could not believe what happened. Lori had no criminal record, and she and her husband were not poor. All these accusations seemed like some kind of monstrous mistake. Since Lars' children sensed that something was wrong, they asked for permission to speak to the investigators about their concerns. They expressed concerns about going to the lake at this time of year. Moreover, their father did not go fishing because he was feeling unwell. Then Dean, Larry's son, spoke about Lori's strange behavior in the days following her father's disappearance. She asked how they would divide the inheritance. Dee was very concerned about his father's death, so he just left without even talking about this topic. It seemed premature to him since his father's body had not yet been found. To somehow reassure the relatives of the deceased, the detective explained how the search was conducted. The sonar group first checked the area of highest probability, but if this does not yield results, they scan the water diagonally in different directions. After Larry's family left, the investigators discussed all the details of the case again. Although Eisenberg's wife was not among the suspects, her behavior in general raised doubts. She could calmly answer all the investigators' questions and explain all the details, but something about the investigation bothered the investigators. The next day, a search was conducted at the Eisenberg house in connection with Lori's fraud allegations, and on February 27th, the woman was arrested for 40 cases of forgery and severe theft at the nonprofit North Idaho Housing Coalition, where she had previously worked as an executive director. Her bail was set at $75,000, which was immediately posted by one of her daughters. However, a shocking discovery happened literally a day later, on March 1st, 2018. Weeks after Larry Eisenberg suddenly fell from his boat into the icy waters of Lake Coeur d'Alene, the body of a man floating face down near the coast was found about 5 kilometers from the accident site indicated by his wife. No suspicious injuries were found on the body, and based on the clothing of the drowned man, it was likely that the search was ultimately successful. The body was pulled from the water and sent for further examination. An autopsy confirmed that it was Larry Eisenberg, but the medical examiner also found out the cause of death. It turned out that Larry did not die in the water since no signs of drowning were found. Toxicological tests revealed lethal concentrations of an antihistamine in his body, which is used to combat allergies and suppress some cold symptoms. This drug acts very quickly but can only be fatal in rare cases if too much is taken in a short time. Larry's antihistamine dose exceeded the norm by 70 times, so according to the medical examiner, Eisenberg died before he fell into the water. The authorities decided not to release the autopsy results immediately. In an earlier statement to the police, Lori mentioned that her husband took a variety of pills every day, then forgot and took them again, often confusing the dosages. It is possible that the woman told the absolute truth, but it is also possible that she gave this information in advance in case the body was found and a lethal dose of drugs was discovered in the body. Lori also insisted that Larry had not been quite healthy lately and had complained of malaise. However, all other relatives unanimously assured the opposite. The only time Eisenberg mentioned his illness was in a text message to a friend on the morning before his disappearance, provided he sent the text himself. An experienced analyst found that Larry's phone was last used near the house of Lori's son after Eisenberg's disappearance. Although the woman claimed she had thrown the mobile phone into the water immediately after calling the rescue service, Lori could not explain how the phone could have been used afterwards. Also, her son from a previous marriage swore and swore that he had never held Larry's mobile phone in his hand. At the end of May, Lori did not appear for the hearing in the fraud case. As it turned out, the woman was trying to avoid punishment. Eisenberg quickly fled the region and was on the run for about 2 months before surrendering to the authorities in July. Detectives who were working on the case of the mysterious death of Larry Eisenberg at the time interrogated colleagues and acquaintances of the deceased. They learned that the first cracks appeared in the couple's ideal relationship. Although Lori and seemed to be a happy couple, the man often complained to his friends in recent months about his wife's excessive spending. He did not like that a large part of their joint savings went to support Lori's children, who had long been independent adults. The investigators also learned that Lori was a rather frivolous woman. She easily cheated on her first husband with 3 different men, including Eisenberg. Although this was in the past, it still did not provide a particularly flattering description of Larry's wife. The topic of betrayal was also raised on the board of the Housing Coalition. However, the next discovery could serve as a concrete motive for the crime. Investigators discovered changes to Larry's will made by none other than Lori. The handwritten changes were made about a month before his death. According to the new will, it turned out that 80% of the inheritance went not to his own children but to 6 stepdaughters, Lori Eisenberg's daughters from another marriage. It is not known what the woman expected when she made these changes. Finally, the authorities released the autopsy results and called this case a comprehensive investigation of a particularly serious crime in which a person died. The investigators even spoke with a doctor who said that Larry was absolutely healthy for his age. He was never prescribed a drug that later ended fatally. Based on all the collected evidence, the police assumed that Lori mixed an excessive dose of medication into the juice bottle. Larry drank the contents and fell under the effect of the toxic drug not far from the shore where he was found overboard. Lori immediately used a trolling motor to move the boat away from the area before calling 911. None of the spouses seemed to have life insurance, which is often a motive for such crimes. However, investigators learned that there was an agreement between the spouses that if one of them died, the other would become the owner of the joint property. Lori planned to use the money to repay the housing coalition. At the time of his death, Larry did not know that his wife was involved in fraud at her workplace and did all this to help her daughters financially. At least that's what she told her children. 2 months later, in July 2018, Lori was tired of hiding because she knew they would find her sooner or later anyway. She contacted the sheriff's office herself, saying she was simply living with her family in California. In early 2019, Lori and her 4 daughters admitted to fraud with the use of electronic communication devices and pleaded guilty to the charges. Lori Eisenberg was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and her daughters received 3 years probation and several hours of community service, as well as a fine of more than $50,000. While Lori was in prison for fraud, the investigation into the strange death of her husband continued. Investigators checked the search history on the woman's phone and found incriminating evidence. While Larry was enjoying their joint trip to Florida, Lori studied depth charts and articles about drownings and boating accidents. Finally, Lori was charged in February 2020, while she was still in federal prison for fraud and embezzlement, with the intentional death of her husband, Larry Eisenberg. Lori, 67, appeared in court in May 2021 for the verdict. She denied until the last that the crime was planned and tried to present everything as an accident. However, the jury did not believe the woman, and Lori Eisenberg was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole only after 30 years. Whether the daughters of a selfish woman are involved in the story of a man's death will remain a mystery forever.